So 1.6, we're going to talk about numbers a little bit more. So we're going to talk about negative numbers, fractions, decimals, percentages, but we're going to talk about it in a little bit more formal of a way. All right. So 1.6, we're going to talk about numbers. So it says describe what kind of numbers you would use to answer each question. So the options I give you are whole numbers. So all whole numbers are just your counting numbers, basically. So you start at 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So it's just 0 counting all the way up to infinity. Negative numbers are just -1, -2, -3, going down towards negative infinity. Fractions, we've been dealing with those a lot, right? So that's just something like 2/3. Decimals, that's like 0.34. So just that decimal point makes it a decimal. And then finally percentages. So something like 10% would be a good example of a percentage. Okay. So for A, it says how many cars are in a parking lot, right? So how many cars are in a parking lot? So that would be whole numbers, negative numbers, fractions, decimals, or percentages. So which one of these types of numbers? Yeah, so Cameron said it, right? So I would use whole numbers. So I would use whole numbers to describe how many cars there are in a parking lot. So that's just our counting numbers, right? Because we can never have like a negative amount of cars in a parking lot, right? We could have a whole car. Hopefully we don't have fractions of a car. I don't know. Maybe it's a junkyard or something. I don't know. So, all right. B says, what is the depth of a submarine relative to sea level if it's descending at 200 feet per hour, right? So I guess I'll draw a little picture here. I'm not very much of an artist, but let's say that's the sea, and we have a submarine down here. I don't know, maybe something like that. I'm not the greatest artist, so. And it says that they're going down, or they're descending at 200 feet per hour. So FPH, feet per hour. So what type of numbers would I use to describe the depth of the submarine? Yeah, I would use negative numbers, right? Because we're just descending by 200 feet, which is a whole number, right? So if we're descending, that means that it's a negative, right? Descending means going down. So I would use negative numbers here. And I guess I should preface this saying that negative numbers, you can also use fractions, because I see somebody put fractions as well. So negative numbers, you could have something like -2/3 as well. It doesn't have to be whole numbers. So as long as it has that negative sign, it's a negative number. Okay. So what about the next one? The next one says Beth purchases a candy bar to share with her children and her husband. How much will each person get? So I could draw a picture again, right? So I have this candy bar, right? And I'm sharing that between a bunch of people, right? So let's say Beth, she has 2 children and she has a husband, right? So Beth, children, husband, okay? So if I want to split this candy bar, what would I use? Yeah, and I would use fractions, right? So I would use fractions because I'm splitting this candy bar up into pieces, right? To share between each person. Okay. And then finally, D says Jake uses a spreadsheet to keep track of his finances. He lists all the purchases and bills for the month as well as any income. How much money does he have left over after paying his bills? So what kind of numbers would I use in this spreadsheet? So looks like whole numbers, negative numbers, and decimals. So yeah, I could see any of those, right? So we might look at whole numbers. Maybe they're bills that are in whole numbers. Maybe he's in debt, or maybe he has a loan. So that could be in negative numbers if he has like student loan. I think the most common answer would probably be decimals, though, because we always deal with decimals with pennies, with quarters, coins and stuff like that. So I would say that the best answer for this one would be decimals. Okay. Okay. Any questions on those first ones before I go into some of the definitions and stuff? Okay. All right. So we'll look at negative numbers first. So it says a negative number is just a number less than 0. We indicate the negative sign by writing a negative sign or negative number by writing a negative sign before it. Positive numbers may have a plus sign in front of them, but they usually do not have a sign before them. So if we look at the example that they give, -5 is a negative number, right? And just 5 or plus 5 is a positive number. So usually we just write 5. We don't worry about the plus sign. Okay. The only number that's special in this case is 0. So 0 is neither positive nor negative. So it's just kind of in the middle. But every real number other than 0 has a sign, right? So if it's 5, it's just assume that it's positive. If it's -5, we're given that it's negative, okay? So one special thing that we can do with numbers, no matter if they're positive or negative, is we can look at the absolute value. So the absolute value of something, the way we notate that is looks like 2 vertical bars. So if we have the absolute value of -5, that's just what those bars are. We're just wondering what's the distance away from 0. So how far is -5 away from 0? Well, it's just 5 units from 0. So basically all absolute values are doing is they're just making whatever's in the absolute value positive, okay? So if you want to look at it like that, or just look at it as the distance from 0, either way, you're just looking at positive units then, okay? All right, so it says 2 numbers that have the same size but opposite signs are called opposites. So the example they give is a positive 17 and a negative 17 are opposites, right? So if we add those 2 numbers together, we just get 0. So they're the same size, they just have different signs. Okay. All right, so when we combine 2 things together, so when we combine the set of whole numbers together with all the negative numbers, we get a new set. We call that the integers. So that is an important term. The integers are basically just all your whole numbers and all your negative whole numbers, right? So we get -5, -4, -3, -2, then all the way up, starting with our counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So those are our integer numbers, okay? All right, any questions on that so far? Look it up. Really the important takeaway, I think, is gonna be the absolute value, which it basically just means you're going to make whatever's in those vertical bars positive. Okay. All right, we'll go to the next page then. Okay. So my first question here, all it says is what is the opposite of -8? So what can I add together with -8 to get to 0? What's the opposite? Yep, just a positive 8, right? So the opposite of -8 is a positive 8. Okay. What about the absolute value of -11? What's the absolute value of -11? Yep, just a positive 11, right? So the absolute value of -11, we just basically look for the positive of what's ever in those vertical bars. So we just make it positive, we get 11. Okay, okay, what is the sign of 24 and what is the size? So basically what I'm asking is 24 positive or negative, and what's the size, or how big is that number? So what do you guys and girls think? What's the sign and size of 24? Yep, so it's a positive sign, right? So the sign is positive, and the size is just the number, right? It's just 24. So one way that we can look at it is the sign is just if it's positive or negative, and the size is just taking the absolute value of the number. So the absolute value of 24, we make it positive. Well, it's already positive, right? So it's still just 24. Okay. So absolute value just lets us know the size of a number. All right. Let's look at the next one. So the next one says simplify this. So it's the negative of a negative 6. So does anybody know how to find the negative of a negative? Well, has anybody heard the phrase, maybe 2 wrongs make a right? Well, in our case, we have 2 negatives will make a positive, okay? So if I have 2 negatives, that will equal a positive number. Okay? So basically what I'm saying is that the negative of a negative is equal to a positive. So negative of a negative 6 is a positive 6. Okay? If you wanted to, you could also look at this as a multiplication. So basically what this negative sign out in the front is, it's just a negative 1. And I'm multiplying that by a negative 6. So we just have negative 1 multiplied by negative 6, which is a positive 6. So you'll still get the same answer. Okay. Okay. What about the negative of the absolute value of 6? Ooh, okay. Maybe I can slow down. Is anybody else's audio not synced?
Synced.
Okay. Okay. Maybe it's just him then. Okay. All right. So let's move on then. So what's the negative of the absolute value of 6?
That would be negative, wouldn't it?
Yes. So what you have to take away here is you're going to take the absolute value first, and then after you take that absolute value, you're going to take the negative of that. So basically what we're doing is I keep the negative sign out front. I take the absolute value, which is a positive 6, and then I just have the negative of 6, which is a negative 6. Okay? All right. Any questions on those 4 or 5, I guess? Okay. All right. So the next exercise we have, it says determine whether the meaning is positive or negative. If it's negative, write it using a negative number. So if we're 100 feet below level, it should say sea level. So if we're 100 feet below sea level, is that a positive or negative number?
Negative.
Negative, right? Because we're 100 feet below sea level. So we could write that as negative 100 feet. Yep. So what about the next one? The next one says we are $500 in the black. Does anybody know what that means?
$500 to the good.
Yes, yeah. So if you're in the black, this is kind of where, I believe this is where Black Friday comes from, right? So when people are shopping and stuff, they're moving businesses into the black or they're making money. So $500 in the black is just a positive $500. Okay? All right. What about the next one? So the next one, I guess I should write positive here. So the next one says, interpret what each one means. So if I say negative 3 or negative 30 degrees F, what does that mean in words?
30 below 0.
Yeah, 30 below 0. Okay. What about the next one? How would you describe that one? So the way I would look at it, I would just rewrite it, but I'm just going to write this in words here. So this percentage and stuff right here. So it just means that a pole has a plus or minus 3%. I guess I'll just write 3% because we know what that means. Margin of error. So that just means that when somebody does a poll, the results that they have for each group might just be off by 3% either way, right? So if we have like maybe a poll of 100 people and maybe 60 people liked candidate A or something like that, we have a 3% margin of error, which basically just means it might be off by 3% up or 3% down. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this page? Okay. All right. So let's look at the next one. So the next one says, write a sentence to explain Lily Lake's enrollment. So it looks like I have how my enrollment changed maybe over 5 years for certain schools in some school district, right? And the one that we're specifically looking at is Lily Lake. So I'm going to circle that one. Okay. So how has our enrollment changed over the last 5 years for that school district or for that school? Anyone have any ideas? How has the enrollment changed, or how can I write a sentence to explain that? Minus 12%. Yeah. Yeah, so I would tend to agree with that, right? So how I would write that in the sentence is that Lily Lake, and I guess I'll just write school, has lost 12% of its students over the last 5 years. Or you could also say maybe their enrollment has gone down 12% from 2013 to 2018. Yeah, I think it's around 11 or 12. It's kind of hard to see on the graph. So 11 or 12%, either one's fine.